It's taxation is theft.
I'm wearing this ironically. I
Oh,
bought
right.
this t-shirt. I wanted to wear it to see your faces when you saw it, since we're talking about taxation of meat.
We wouldn't charge non-drivers for the costs of maintaining roads. We wouldn't charge non-smokers for the medical costs entailed by smoking. I would argue we shouldn't charge vegans for the costs of eating meat, dairy, and eggs.
Today I am making available an initial £330 billion of guarantees, equivalent to 15% of our GDP.
So that's what this video is going to be about. And to help me, I've enlisted the aid of Cosmic Skeptic and Humane Hancock, a philosopher and an activist, so that we may analyse whether we should or should not tax meat, dairy and eggs. So, if you find my argument convincing that we should implement an excise tax on meat, dairy and eggs, one at the stage of manufacturing and one at the stage of the consumer, then you'll find a petition below from which you can sign. Thank you and enjoy the video.
And if you would like to introduce yourselves, Cosmic Skeptic, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's not much to say except that I am indeed Cosmic Skeptic. My real name is Alex. I was a philosophy of religion YouTuber, I guess you could call me, turned vegan advocate. Kind of came out of nowhere to both myself and my audience, but now I spend a lot of time talking about animal rights and animal suffering. And I haven't spoken before on this topic. I think I'm losing connection. Am I losing connection?
Yeah, you lost connection there. You can pick up from. I think that.
Okay, well, it's not that important. I was only talking about myself anyway. But I'm essentially just now, I guess you could call me an animal rights advocate on YouTube.
Yeah, and I would recommend everyone actually check out his talk in Israel. Very nice. It was a very good talk. And Humane Hancock, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's not much to say other than that I'm Humane Hancock, but my real name is Jack, and I suppose I'm a street activist. I went vegan around 3 years ago after watching lots of online content, like of Ed Winter's, different street interviews, and I decided to start doing it myself. So over the last, let's say, 2.5 years, I've been doing lots of street interviews, lots of debate videos, and recently talking about other topics within animal ethics as well, like wild animal suffering.
Yeah, and I would recommend everyone check out his channel. Essentially, he makes it look very easy. Street activism isn't easy at all, because I've given it a go, and a lot of the time you get absolutely nowhere, I've found, and he makes it look very, very easy. So well done. And obviously, I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Perspective Philosophy. My real name's Lewis. I'm a philosophy PhD student. I am actually writing my PhD on vegan ethics, taking a Hegelian stance to vegan ethics, arguing that we should be vegan. It's a moral obligation, and that if we apply reason, we'll come to the sentientist conclusion. So here we are. Now, the reason I kind of brought this kind of group together, I thought, for this discussion is, one, we're all based in the UK, at least as far as I'm aware. and two, essentially, I thought with you both being kind of not only activists, but especially Humane Hancock, I think you're quite in touch with the general people in relation to veganism. I think the issue is that when you talk about something like taxation, you kind of want to know what public opinion is going to be and how you think they might react. And I think you will probably have the best understanding of that, probably better than me and Alex, in the sense that I think you've been more publicly engaged than both of us, which I think is immensely helpful. And obviously, you're a capable vegan advocate. And obviously, Cosmic Skeptic, you and Alex, you've been academically very engaged. And so obviously with the arguments, you'll be able to tell me if I'm logically incorrect, and we can see how we can go with this. And obviously I'm the guy that thought, no, I think we should tax meat, dairy, and eggs. And essentially, the reason I'm proposing that we tax meat, dairy, and eggs in this scenario is because I feel that every vegan around the world has been actively disadvantaged by COVID-19. I mean, we all have been disadvantaged by it in general. I don't know about you, but I'm locked in my house, if anyone else is as well. And it's horribly unfair for those of us who don't participate in, the consumption of animal products. COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease, which means a disease transmitted from animals to humans. And we think that it originated originally in bats, made its way to something like a pangolin or a snake, may have been consumed at a wet market in China, and has now become a pandemic level threat globally. So essentially, what we need to do is mitigate that damage. And our governments have already done that with a £350 billion cash payout. That's the idea that we're going to do. We're going to put 350 billion into the economy to mitigate this damage. That action has already been taken. So what is left is who picks up the bill. So I'll ask you, who do you guys think should pick up the bill for this pandemic?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
So I can fire away. So I think generally I like the idea. I think it would be good to have a system in place that means that industries pay for the damage they do. But I guess I do have a few clarifying questions. And my first one, I suppose, is what exactly is the goal? Is your goal to decrease the amount of meat people eat to reduce the likelihood of future pandemics? Or is it to just create a fund to help with future pandemics? What exactly is it you're trying to achieve?
Well, I think the most important thing that we need to think about in this scenario is whether we are actually going to be successful in the first place. And I think there's a good chance that we're not going to be successful in creating it, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, of course. But the purpose of this tax is first and foremost to get people talking about whether they are taking a risk in eating meat, dairy, and eggs with their own health and with the global health of their communities. So just even get the ethical conversation going, as it were. I think that has to be the first thing that we'll consider. The second thing I'd say is, if we were successful, what would this money be used for? And I think that the money could be used for so many things in relation to pandemic relief. Zoonotic diseases are not just things like COVID. Like we're actually quite lucky with COVID-19. It's got a mortality rate of 3%. H5N1 bird flu had a mortality rate of over 60%. So if something as virulent as COVID, but as deadly as H5N1 were to strike our general population, it would be catastrophic. And that kind of risk needs to be mitigated. It needs to be treated with education. It needs to be treated with preparation for our health service. And since we cannot prohibit the product, because that would be undemocratic, the actions of the many still need to be held accountable for their responsibility towards creation of global pandemics. And so I would say that we could use this money overall to help educate and better prepare ourselves for these events. That would be the idea.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it's really important to stress education for a number of reasons, including public perception. I guess we're going to go into that later. I guess what comes to mind with me is that there needs to be a standardized set of criteria for how we decide which industry gets taxed, right? So, I mean, what about other industries that use animals other than meat, dairy, and eggs? Is it just a case that if you have live animals or dead animals on the production line, you get taxed? So, for instance, we have zoos, circuses, pet shops, breeders, scientific institutions. I mean, what about animal shelters? Should they be taxed? Why specifically meat, dairy, and eggs?
Yeah, I'd say specifically unnecessary. I would say unnecessary uses of animals. I think people will argue that animal testing is necessary, and I think that at least then that we can have that argument. Obviously, as a vegan, I would obviously argue it isn't. But people will obviously make that argument. With animal shelters, it's not as if these animals didn't already exist and we aren't committing a charitable act in just preserving their lives. We've bred them, and so the animal shelter, I don't think, should be culpable for the cost of keeping an animal alive that has been brought into existence without their permission. I think that should be put on a breeder. And I think you're right in this scenario that if you are, let's say, a breeder or a circus or someone that's producing animals in this scenario and housing them, especially unnecessarily, they are the ones that should be picking up the cost. So it shouldn't just be meat, dairy, and eggs. I do think that. But I think that meat, dairy, and eggs obviously is the largest overall industry involved. I think that obviously you've got pet breeders and so on. But I guess like what I was going to actually point out is that it's also how we charge this tax. So if it's an excise duty, upon the manufacturer, that's normally done by per unit. So like per unit of, let's say, alcohol produced, like per bottle of alcohol, they would get a tax in a manufacturing like scenario, like, you know, a certain rate based off the cost of the product, right? Levied straight to the manufacturer. What I would say is that we shouldn't do that with meat, dairy, and eggs, because it's not as effective when we're talking about zoonotic disease risk. We need to consider what the risk factors are. And I think the risk factors are in relation to space. I think space is like how many animals you have housed in its per square meter is a really important factor to how virulent and you know, how deadly a disease could become, because it could spread much faster among many more animals. So this tax, I think, would probably, in this respect, be levied against the largest manufacturers most prominently, the ones that are crowding animals into factory farms and you know, creating the most unhygienic environments. And so I would suggest that we charge for animals per square meter housed.
Right. So it could be the case that if we had, say, a family-run small farm with very, very few animals, you wouldn't want that product taxed.
Well, I would say that they should get taxed, but the lowest band of the tax. Obviously, the risk is still there, but the taxation would be considerably less per unit than someone like Tyson Foods, who have 10,000 chickens in one single you know, farm.
So part of what you're hoping to do is education. So say if we imagine it in like a COVID-19 scenario now, where we're taxing meat to create this fund that's going to help us deal with this issue. So it could be the case. I mean, I guess it could be kind of a funny, ironic issue here where people will be encouraged to buy more meat so that we can beat COVID-19, as in buy more meat and we'll fund more ventilators, and we can have TV ads telling us to support the NHS by buying more meat, right?
I think that's actually one of the best criticisms of the argument, is that it kind of creates a perverse incentive for the government to push the product.
Yeah.
They wouldn't want to educate people to not use the product because they're making money on it. And obviously the government want to make money off tax. So there is the issue there. But I think obviously there needs to be a twofold recognition that, one, the cost of a pandemic will be far greater than whatever amount the tax could actually generate. I think COVID-19 is a great example because it's a fairly mild pandemic as far as it goes. Like, as I say, a mortality rate of 3%, but has absolutely crippled our economies globally. The amount the economy's lost in the last 3 weeks is far greater than any tax that we could actually generate. This amount of money would really be only useful for like small educational changes, and maybe pre-buying ventilators, you know, to prevent an overwhelmed healthcare system. But it shouldn't be, you know, seen as like a massive way to generate a large amount of income for the government. And obviously there is a relation to how the government spends money. Like, nothing really holds them in check so much. But that's an issue with taxation itself rather than this specific tax.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm interested to see what Alex has to say about this.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. Earlier, Lewis, you said that, well, we can't ban these products because that would be undemocratic. So instead we institute some kind of tax. Well, is not a tax also undemocratic if the majority are not in favor of it?
Well, I think obviously the majority would have to be in favor of whatever, like, you know, the government would be putting through. That's kind of how democracy works. But I think we also want to be careful of the tyranny of the many. We don't want a society which treats its minority groups as being unequal to themselves, able to take risks with other individuals' health and well-being, whilst not providing any compensation for the risks that they are willing to induce. I think that a good example is that many people mightn't have wanted tax on petrol or alcohol, but the damage that these products cause is undeniable, and so we have to be held culpable for and responsible for our actions in consuming these products.
Well, is that are you talking just about, when you say like a health problem, are you talking just about the health of the people themselves, as in something like a sugar tax, or the health of people around them, as in something like a smoking tax?
Well, this is the thing. I think that, funnily enough, with meat, dairy, and eggs, it's obviously both.
Yeah, but which are you in favour of the taxation on the grounds of both, or just one or the other?
I would probably say that in this case, I'm primarily looking at on the grounds of health of other people, because I think that's the strongest position. I think that's like overall, people understand that, you know, if you are a smoker and you are, you know, committing secondhand smoke and it gives people cancer, then you're doing something wrong. And I don't think anyone really has a problem with that. Hence, we ended up prohibiting smoking indoors in public areas. Obviously, I think the overall greatest effect to a health system on a day-to-day basis is the cost to the individual's health in terms of like cholesterol and saturated fat. But then I think we need to not just tax meat, dairy, and eggs in that respect, and tax saturated fat and cholesterol producing foods in that respect, if we're talking about the health of the individual.
Well, this is where I think we diverge, because I don't think people should be taxed for the sake of their own health. I'm not in favor of that kind of state paternalism. I think that if you want to institute a tax that says that in order to disincentivize people from harming other people, that's fair game. That's essentially government's job. But if you start saying that if you want to make this choice for yourself, knowing the consequences don't extend beyond yourself, and it poses a health risk to yourself, we're not going to let you, or we're going to make it harder for you by instituting a tax, I think that you're abridging their freedom. Would you agree?
Could the argument not be that people having heart disease is costing the NHS billions of pounds?
It could be. However, you want to be careful with that line of thought, because the same thing's true of people who do extreme sports, for instance. It's costing the NHS a lot of money when they injure themselves, but we wouldn't take a similar approach. Also, funnily enough, there was, who was it now? It was a tobacco company. I can't remember which country it was, but there were calls to ban smoking for the sake of health or something like this. I can't remember the exact details, but I'll try and find it and link it afterwards. And the company commissioned a study which attempted to show why the grounds of that you're suggesting there of, you know, taxing or banning something because of the cost for the National Health Service is actually misplaced. Because if somebody gets heart disease, right, they die fairly quickly. They don't live as long. If someone's being unhealthy, if they're a smoker, if they're eating red meat a lot, then they're going to die more quickly. Whereas people who were healthier actually went on to live longer lives and develop more long-term old age illnesses, which actually cost the NHS even more money.
Right.
So I'm not sure if that justification quite works.
We should tax not smoking.
Well, this is the weird kind of, if we're going to say that, if we're going to say something along the lines of, well, if you as an individual are causing more burden on our National Health Service than somebody else because of this action, we're going to tax the action. I think that's a dangerous road to go down.
I think that first, I would definitely call into question whether that's true or not, because I mean, if you look at like the cost of like statin drugs, for example, you could be healthy. A healthy individual walking around day to day, quote unquote, but really you're actually on, you know, 5 different medications. Don't get me wrong. I do believe that you're right in showing that it's not just meat, dairy, and eggs that are dangerous, like, and not just that induce health risks and health costs for our health system. But when we, you know, when, for example, only tax tobacco, are we doing it to disincentivize people from smoking, or are we doing it to cover the costs that tobacco induces to our national? And remember, the NHS is a national health system. It's a universal health system charging everyone. It's not as if these people are paying insurance and, you know, paying for their own healthcare. They are having their healthcare paid for them, you know, by the universal system. And
it's being paid for by ourselves. It's essentially a different kind of health insurance.
Essentially, I think the difference is that the health insurance calculates risk. If you're doing extreme sport, the health insurance your premiums will reflect the fact that you are Tony Hawk and you're going to be paying through the nose. If you're part of the National Health Service, you're paying a standard rate based off your taxation. You are taxed on your income, and that will go towards the overall production of a national universal.
And this is something that we celebrate, right? We say that this is a good thing. However, if we're going to start being in favor of, you know, judging people's decisions individually and seeing if maybe especially if this tax money is specifically to fund the NHS to kind of mitigate the costs of the damage, then you're essentially saying, well, if you commit this action, then we're going to tax you more. All right. And if we consider a national health service to be a kind of health insurance of a sort, then if you say to somebody, look, if you commit this kind of action, you're going to be paying slightly more for this taxation, for this kind of insurance, then you're essentially beginning to mirror private insurance health companies by saying, what we're going to do is we're going to judge your circumstances, and based on how much of a risk you pose to your own health, we're going to charge you a different amount to ensure that you'll be able to get the healthcare that you need. I don't think this is a good idea.
I think it is, and I'll explain twofold the difference between that and a private system. I think the private system would take into consideration things that you cannot control. You could be born an epileptic, and they will take that into consideration. The difference between being born an epileptic and purchasing a product which is dangerous is volition. You have chosen to purchase that product. You have chosen to become, Tony Hawk and, go down like half pipes and stuff. And they need to be considered in your actions. And you know that these could induce healthcare costs. And if you're not willing to pick up the bill, at least a portion of the bill, like not all of it, but just in respect to perhaps some of the risks that you cause, then how can you say that you're okay with doing these sports? Because that bill is going to exist anyway. It's not as if it's going to go away and fly away into the distance. What's going to happen is that bill is then going to be split among everyone. And what we are then expecting people to pay is for the actions of other individuals. So then we create a secondary risk where we expect somebody else to be paying the costs of healthcare for someone that they never met and they disagree wholeheartedly with their actions. It's like,
that
was weird. Zoom just removed the 40-minute time limit there.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
I just want to say that I think there's something we're perhaps missing here, which is that I don't think you'd be in favor of instituting the same kind of tax on Tony Hawk.
Well, I think that the issue is how we implement tax there. Taxation is a universally applied scenario, and I think it's a lot harder to tax very specific individual actions versus large scale like actions like smoking. It's a product that you buy.
Well, we tax skateboarding companies. We tax Plan B. We tax Almost. We tax Thunder trucks.
I don't think I would have a problem with that, to be entirely honest with you.
So now we've got a situation where we essentially, if we take this logic to its conclusion, we must. So, for example, I don't know. As a society becomes more educated, the suicide rate also increases. So, are we going to start taxing books? I mean, the thing is, like, where are we stopping this? We either have a nationalized health service that says you pay in based on your income, and if anybody needs it, they can have it. If they've made a bad choice, they've made a bad choice. But it is not our decision as doctors to judge morally their lifestyle choices, but to make sure that they're well again. And sure, it may be unfair. It may kind of suck that you're footing the bill for someone else's poor decision. But the alternative is that we don't have this system of national health care, and instead we have a system of you are now kind of responsible through taxation and your own actions for providing for your own healthcare. It's like, which you want to pick? I think I'd rather have the first option, even if it means that I'm footing the bill for someone who's an alcoholic and develops liver problems.
But the thing is, you're not footing the bill for the alcoholic because the alcoholic is charged a duty. That's the point. Like you're not footing the bill for the tobacco smoker because they're charged a duty.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
I see, but I don't know if I'm in favor of those either. I'm
talking
in the abstract.
So you'd say I'm
talking in the abstract here. I'm not saying I would. I'm just saying I'm just saying, look, these are things worth thinking about.
I think also you mentioned, I think one of the differences between, say, taxing Tony Hawk and taxing meat would be practical issues with taxing extreme sports. But I think we can imagine there'd be lots of practical issues with taxing animal products as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, let's say if I'm someone who's going to buy lots of meat, but I have private healthcare, does that mean every time I go to the shop to buy it, do I say, I've got private healthcare, so I shouldn't be taxed for this?
Yeah, I mean, private healthcare is one of those, it's an additional choice, isn't it? It's one of those things where you can say that maybe someone get taxed less for having private healthcare, for example, like they're not contributing to the universal system. I think there is an argument. I think libertarians would love that argument.
I think it's also the argument you seem to be making. If you use the logic in the other direction, right? I like your T-shirt. If you use the argument in the other direction, if we're going to say that that we're in favor of charging people more money because of the risk that they pose in terms of and it seems here that the only justification we're really giving is an economic one. It's like, well, you're going to cost us more money, so we deserve to tax you more. It should follow, it seems to me, that if someone says, well, actually, no, I'm not in any way going to be causing any kind of economic burden, not just to the extent that I shouldn't be taxed for my meat, but to the extent that I shouldn't be taxed for my smoking or my alcohol either.
Well, I think the difference is, I think there's two things to mention as well. One, the universal system I'm 100% in favor of. I would definitely say I think the NHS is perhaps one of the greatest medical systems in the world, and we should definitely keep it. Please, for the love of God, let us not sell off any more of it. So yeah, I'll definitely say that. And I think it's not incompatible with something like, you know, an alcohol duty or tobacco duty or a meat, dairy and eggs duty. I think that it's absolutely compatible with it, because all that you're doing is you're saying that, look, the NHS is a universal system that needs funded. It's going to have to get funded from somewhere. We are going to be taxing in some manner the population. Now, it can be a universal tax on income, or it can be a specific tax in relation to risk. Now, the hope is that people simply stop eating, drinking and smoking. You know, stop eating meat, dairy and eggs, and stop drinking alcohol, and they stop, you know, smoking tobacco. And the idea that we don't need the money. Then it's not about generating income. It's about reducing the burden on the NHS. Also, there's the point that because the NHS is the primary method, and if not the only method for the majority of the population to receive medical treatment, if it's not compensated, if the cost isn't compensated and the NHS collapses in a pandemic-like event, people may die from this lack of funding. And if we try and implement a tax on everyone, it could be equally as unpopular as a meat, dairy and eggs tax, and it mightn't be accepted. The idea that, for example, people might not accept that they are responsible for the actions of someone in China eating, you know, a snake, which is fair enough, but they should be understanding themselves as responsible for, let's say, a slaughterhouse worker contracting mad cow's disease in the UK. You know, like 10 years ago, or probably more like 20 years ago now, actually, wouldn't it? That was a genuine risk. And the fact that we are placing individuals into these scenarios, we have to consider that if we don't cover these costs, there will not be a society from which we can rely upon, and which individuals can rely upon. The necessary foundations of our society will crumble.
It seems to me that we either have to decide that this is something we're all willing to foot the bill for, because also, I mean, look, there are not all NHS operations are linked to meat, dairy and eggs, right? There are all kinds of things that it does that aren't related in any way. It fixes people's arms when they break them, for instance. How are we going to allocate this funding? And are we? So I'm just the problem for me is that if the logic is kind of, you are causing the government an economic deficit by committing this action, which requires this action, which requires this amount of money. It's like, are we going to track and make sure the person is paying because of the action they take for the mitigation? Because to me, that if you're going to do that there, why don't you do this everywhere? Why don't we do this across all aspects of healthcare? You also said a moment ago, when Jack asked, look, if you create this tax, then you potentially create an incentive for people to buy these products to fund the NHS. And you said, well, this is true, but what we need to do is just kind of push the idea that, you know, the health of the country is more important, and it's than your eating of meat. And it's like, well, we can do that anyway, and we should be doing that anyway.
I mean, I wouldn't push the idea that they simply push an idea. I mean, like, to be entirely honest with you, like, as a philosopher, obviously, I would not be in favor of simply, you know, crossing my fingers and hoping everything works out okay. I think the idea of what I would recommend is that everyone should be trying to hold their government in check. I think that governments have far too much power, actually, and that they need to be held accountable for their actions. And I would argue for the limitation of government power, the distribution of the fund across councils. I think that would be a good way to do it. So rather than relying upon individual large-scale organized action from a single central body, we could instead have smaller bodies which can be held accountable by their constituents.
But what about the general idea, the kind of moral idea that can sit within people that says, look, if I buy this product, then I am funding the NHS, so it may be a good thing to do. Or at the very least, they might think, somebody right now might be thinking, I don't know if I should be buying these products because they're unhealthy and they're going to cause problems to our health service. But now, because this tax has been instituted, it's probably okay now. Now at least I'm paying for it. It kind of takes the weight off their back. They no longer need to think, because now if you want to come to people after this tax is implemented and say, listen, we really shouldn't be eating animal products, they say, well, who the hell are you? I mean, we've already instituted this tax. I'm already paying my dues, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm paying for this now. Like, whatever risks you can put in front of me have now been mitigated by this tax that you implemented. And now what, you want more? And the only way that I think we could justify saying we want more is by pressing the point that this is an ethical kind of motivation underlying everything rather than just an economic one. So for me, for instance, it seems as though, well, intuitively, I want to say, damn right, if you're going to be eating animals, you should be paying more for it. But I don't want to say the same thing about Tony Hawk. I think if I'm honest about my motivations, that's just because of my ethical problem with people eating animals and my ethical agnosticism on Tony Hawk, right? And so I'm trying to kind of make sure that ethical motive isn't clouding my economic views. And if we're just basing this on economic, then I can't help but see the two situations in the same light.
But is it, actually, Jack, would you like to go?
No, I mean, I just completely agree with everything you just said. I don't think I could say it any better.
Right.
That, so.
Oh, well, I don't. Funnily enough, essentially what I would say is that Tony Hawk or someone like that, let's say they're making millions off taking high risks with their health. I actually don't have a problem with someone who profits, who's created a business that overall then dispenses its costs onto a national healthcare system. I think that is just another way that capitalism can dispense costs onto onto the people, onto the taxpayer. That's just another corporation mitigating its costs with taxpayer funding. Tony Hawk, if he makes a lot of money from going down very big hills on a skateboard, then he needs to recognize that if he breaks his leg, then he's somewhat culpable and liable for that cost because he knew that this cost could be implemented. Tony Hawk would probably pay very little, in fact. And even if we were to say, like, Tony Hawk, why don't you pay like for a cast? And he pays like, 200 quid for or something like that additionally a year for the risk that he takes. He's still making a considerable amount of money. I don't see the problem there.
But look, I mean, so I don't want to interrupt if you're still going.
Sorry, I was just going to say as well that, as I say, there is a very big difference between volition and not volition. I would still want this healthcare system to be universal across the board. Like, if Tony Hawk could not pay, we would still pay. We will respect the fact that he is a human and that he is entitled to healthcare simply for being a human. And that is the bedrock of our society, that for society to function, we will always compensate healthcare. But the point is that for that to continue to function, we are going to need to generate more income. And to generate more income, we are going to need to increase taxes. And the method that we increase taxes should be related to the risks that are being induced, especially those risks that have moral harm and hazard involved, as you say. Obviously, you're saying that yours is it's related to this idea that, if you're going to eat animals, you're going to hurt another being, then you should pay more because you are doing something wrong. But you are also doing something wrong when you take the risk with another person's life. If, let's say, my mother's a stage 4 cancer patient, for example, right? She's also a vegan and she has one lung, and COVID-19 could easily kill someone like that, as you could imagine. Now, someone has taken a risk in eating an animal product which has produced a pandemic threat which could kill my mother. Now, should she be expected to pay the costs of her own healthcare if somebody else induced those costs? If someone drove into her with a car, would we expect them to pay those costs, or would we expect her to pay those costs?
I think it depends on whether the driver did it on purpose or not. Because if the intention were not harm, and there's a motor accident, I think it makes sense to say that when the person who was harmed in a motor accident is taken to the hospital, they are treated the same as anybody else on the money that is funded by the taxation of the general populace, and not based on the taxing of drivers because they run the risk of getting into the car, or not based on taxing people who live near busy streets because they have an increased risk of getting hit by a car or something like this. I think that if we start taking this logic where it leads, then we start getting a bit too nitpicky, and we're kind of losing the ideal of having a healthcare system that, as you say, will cover you when you walk in, regardless of who you are, right? It's like, that's the justification. It might suck. Like, I might think that this doesn't, but it's the same thing as like if somebody's treating somebody for, if the NHS is treating somebody for lung cancer because they've, because they're smoking cigarettes, and maybe they started smoking cigarettes when they were 9 years old under the influence of their parents. It's not their fault, right? Like, should I, right, much less the child, should I be expected to foot the bill for the child's continuation of smoking cigarettes, even, especially because the child didn't make the decision itself, but the parents made the decision for the child? And essentially, it's like, well, what happens if we say no there? Like, who foots the bill here? And how are we going to regulate that? Like, it seems to me a massively troublesome project if we start thinking along those lines.
I completely agree. Although I guess the point I'd make is whether they could have acted differently. The 9-year-old child, I don't think is a moral agent. I don't think that they're responsible for their actions. The parents are responsible for their actions. And in due course, I think that we would fine the parents for what they've done to the child. We would take legal action against them. We say, you've committed child abuse.
Sure, but what's the justification now? We're the justification there, when we do that and we find them, as you say, we charge them for child abuse. We don't make an economic argument that says, well, you've cost the NHS X amount of money, so we're going to fine you for it. We say we're fining you as an incentive not to abuse your children. It's not economically motivated.
Well, you see, I think that, I think that the idea of a fine not being economically motivated is somewhat perverse. I think that charging people money simply to, change their behaviors, unless it's an actual crime, would be a problem, wouldn't it? So we couldn't, let's say, like, charge someone for simply committing an action. Like, you went down the wrong street, he has a fiver. It's got to be, if it's got to be a fine related to a crime, it's got to be something which imposes a general risk to another individual, and that's what we are mitigating there. And that,
or to yourself, apparently, or I suppose to the National Health Service, right? Because, like, with the sugar tax, for instance, that's only posing a harm to yourself.
Well, I mean, the sugar tax, I mean, the whole point of it is that I think Nozick points this out with the justice system, is that if we have a justice system and we don't fund the most essential, give people like a possibility of obtaining a lawyer or anything along those lines, we're not going to actually have a justice system. We're going to have basically a monopoly which controls justice, and you pay into it, and then essentially you receive high levels of justice, and quote unquote, and somebody else receives lower levels of justice. You pay for the best solicitor, you win the case. The other person doesn't have a solicitor, they lose the case, and we have an unjustified system. Same thing with healthcare. You could have a lot of money, you could pay for all your risks, you could be putting loads of money in to mitigate the harms that you generate yourself, and not fund another, and that would be unjustified. The whole point is that we are going to need a universal system in this respect to maintain overall society, and we should always be willing to foot the bill for that. We accept that cost simply for existing in a society. If we wish to,
right,
yeah, those costs have to end at some point. They can't cover all human action. I can't say that let's say dispersing asbestos into a small space, just like rubbing it together and blowing it into people's faces, into people's rooms, should not deserve punishment, because it should, not just because it causes a moral harm to an individual, but because it increases the risk of, and someone's going to have to pay for the bill. Otherwise, let's say, if on a smaller scale, let's say we could not afford to pay for these people's treatment, hypothetically, where would you suggest we get the money from? The people who have been they've blown their asbestos in their face?
Unfortunately, I think, as you say, we either accept that we all collectively foot the bill for the general well-being of society, or we do not. You have to take your pick. I think that these should be separable. If somebody commits a crime against another person, and the person who commits the crime is fined, I think that the way that most people would understand the law, and most people would understand the justification for the law, is that they've committed a crime, they've done something wrong, therefore they're legally prosecuted, as a disincentive to do it again, as a prevention for them doing it again. It is not, in my understanding, the way that the law works, or the way that most people think of the law, to say, good, I'm glad that the child abuser has been fined and thrown in jail, because because of the fact that the money that we've raised can now be, given to the NHS, which can help the child. Like, no, that's not why we fine them. That's not why we put them in jail. That's a separable issue. I don't think that that's how fines do work.
It is a separable issue. I understand that. But the point of the matter is that if those fines and that money wasn't generated, and we come to the point in which we weren't able to help the victims, then it would be that would be a calamity. It would be a catastrophe in itself.
That would only occur in a situation where we don't have a nationalized healthcare service where everybody is paying into the system.
It would come into a situation where the funding for that health system is in check, and the NHS has been in deficit for a considerable amount of time. And also, I think there's another issue, obviously, that this is a moral hazard. You are actually deliberately placing someone at risk. It's not as if you are being charged. Like with smoking, it's you are actively placing other people at risk with your smoking. We recognize that. That's why we charge you with duty. We know that secondhand smoke causes cancer. So
what did we do?
We also know that smoking increases health costs. And I think the same thing can be said with meat, dairy, and eggs. You make the decision to eat meat, dairy, and eggs. Now, we can't prohibit that because it simply will not pass. If we could ban meat, dairy, and eggs, I would be in favor of banning meat, dairy, and eggs. I don't know about
on what grounds.
Oh, it would definitely be. Well, it would be. I think primarily moral grounds. I would 100% advocate that we stop eating meat, dairy, and eggs on moral grounds.
But this is what I'm saying. If we're sure, and I don't mean to. Sorry, a moment ago, my connection isn't very good. I sometimes miss things, and I think I'm trying to jump in when people haven't actually finished talking.
That's fine. It's probably me.
What we do, or what we did when we recognized that smoking causes, if you're smoking indoors, right, versus smoking outdoors, the difference is that if you smoke indoors, you're actively causing a threat, as you say, to other people. If you're smoking outdoors, you're only causing a threat to yourself, right? Obviously with some reservations, but generally speaking. So what do? Well, we have a smoking tax on people who smoke outdoors, and we have a smoking ban on smoking indoors, because we recognize that if you're causing a harm to yourself, maybe we could say there's an economic justification for making you pay more into the system. However, if you're causing harm to other people directly, then we either say that you're not allowed to do it, or we say that you are, and taxing it smacks of kind of the reformist logic or the moderation logic, right? And so if we agree in the same respect that eating animal products is so harmful and more harmful potentially than smoking, then it's like we either have to be in favor of banning it on those grounds, or else we sound like reformists, or else we sound like people who are saying, well, I'm in favor of taxing people who smoke and then blow the smoke on their infant children, right? It's like, no, I'm sorry, I can't be in favor of a tax on that. I'm either going to be in favor of banning it, or if I'm not in favor of banning it, then it must be justifiable. And if it's justifiable, then I think somebody should be able to make that decision for themselves. The issue here is that obviously they shouldn't be able to make that decision for themselves because they're harming other people. But if that's the case, what is the most legitimate? I'm not saying the only legitimate, let's be careful here, but what is the most legitimate role of government? It's to prevent people from harming others. It's to stop them. It's to stop them from doing so. And if we're so certain that eating animal products in this respect is going to cause such harm or such potential harm to other citizens, then we have every justification to ban the products, more justification than we do to just tax it, which seems like either a half measure or to misunderstand the actual issue we're facing.
I have a question for Alex, I suppose. What's your opinion on a sugar tax? Are you against it?
I think I have to be, yes.
Even though it's improving health outcomes in our population?
Yes, I think because again, look, I mean,
you're a utilitarian, right?
Is the yeah, but of course I'm a utilitarian who believes in a concept of human rights, wherein if there is a situation that seems by doing X action it will maximize pleasure, it may not actually maximize pleasure overall to institute that as a policy. And I think that one of the best ways to maximize well-being in a society is to have a government that knows its place. And I think that a government's place is to protect people's freedoms more than it is to be paternalistic and protect their welfare from themselves. Like obviously, a government needs to protect their welfare from other people, but the government it shouldn't be the job of government to protect people from themselves, right? If somebody is harming themselves by eating too much sugar or something, it's like as long as we are educating people on the risks and they know the risks, if they make that decision, then for us to stop them. It's the government saying, we know your interests better than you do, and we're gonna coerce you to act in this particular way because we think you should, not because you're harming somebody else, not because you're infringing on anybody else's liberty, but because we know what's best for you. This seems to me a terrible way to govern a citizenry.
If I may jump in, I think it's funny that you're utilitarian and you're saying that it's about liberty and respecting the will of individuals and not about the overall outcome of the scenario. I mean, surely
it is about the overall outcome still.
Okay, but in respect to that liberty as being a good for the individual.
No, in respect to, I think that the protection of liberty is overall a better way to a better decision, a better what am I looking for here? A better method. Yes, a bit more conducive of overall pleasure than trying to kind of judge each situation individually. In other words, I think that to be a utilitarian is not always the utilitarian thing to do, because you spend so much time analyzing every single option that to apply the hedonic calculus, the action of applying the hedonic calculus is itself going to minimize pleasure. I think what we have to do is take the million route. Some people call him a rule utilitarian. I don't think this is exactly true. He just thinks that if you're going to have a morality based on Christianity, it doesn't mean you have to read the Bible every single time you make a decision. It's like you have general rules which you recognize if you follow, you're going to be sticking. You're going to be sticking to the general principle. You don't have to, as he says, you don't have to kind of rewrite the almanac every single time that you make a decision when you are navigating. You have signposts along the way, right? And we've got certain signposts for the maximization of utility, including a government's protection of liberty. And if we're in favor of a government's protection of liberty, which I think that we can generally agree on, I think I can give a utilitarian defense of that. Maybe you think I can't, but whatever our justification is, we can at least agree that probably, I presume, freedom is better than coercion, right? As a general principle. And so if you're going to be in favor of coercing people, restricting their freedom, it's like you better have a good justification. And I don't think it's a good enough justification for the government to say, well, we know what's better for you.
I think, funnily enough, it's the exact opposite. I'd say that you are not respecting an individual if you do not charge them the costs of their actions. I think that you are treating them as children, and that you are mitigating the costs in saying that they aren't paying for what they have decided to do. I think Hegel makes a good argument about this in relation to crime, that if you don't punish a criminal, then you are actively treating them as if they didn't or could not have known better, which means that you are treating them as if they are not a moral agent. You are treating them as if they are not capable of an ethical decision-making process. And that means that they aren't truly free. You aren't respecting or recognizing their liberty to act.
I see what you're saying, but I mean, who's treating the citizenry like children here? To me, it seems it's the person who's saying, eat your greens. No, you don't get to have your pudding. You don't have too much sugar. It's like, come on, like this is what we're doing when we say, look, if you want to have that sugar, you're going to pay a bit more because you need to make sure you watch your health. It's like, thank you, I know I'm perfectly capable of taking care of my own health. If I want to make a decision to drink a bunch of alcohol, knowing the risks, it's like, that's my decision to make. And sure, somebody might say, but what the hell, man? If you then go to hospital, I'm going to have to foot the bill for that. It's like, yeah, just as if you go skydiving and your parachute fails, I'm going to foot the bill for you. It's like, welcome to the National Healthcare Service. Like, your problem seems to be not a problem with me and my drinking habits, but a problem with nationalized healthcare.
No, I actually love nationalized healthcare. I just think that certain risky behaviors should be targeted as.
But okay, so let me put it this way then. Forget Tony Hawk, because Tony Hawk is a very rich man. I met the man. I bumped into him in a toilet once. That was quite
really? That's actually pretty cool, man.
I was coming out of the toilet, and as you're both, one person's coming in and one person's going out, and I said, "Oh, sorry, mate," and then I realized it was Tony Hawk, so I turned around.
Was he on a skateboard at the time?
He was not on a skateboard, no. I wish I'd have bought my skateboard so that he could have signed it. I've got a Rodney Mullen signed skateboard. I should have got him signed it as well. The inventor of the kickflip, that's Rodney Mullen. But I turned around, and what I should have said is, Mr. Hawk, yeah, big fan, welcome to Oxford, good to meet you. But instead I was so kind of surprised that I just pointed at the man and went, oh, and said nothing else. So as far as he's concerned, somebody walking out of the toilet kind of bumped into him, went, "Sorry, mate." Oh. and then he kind of went, "All right," and then walked into the toilet. And then I turned around and there was somebody sat on a bench who'd witnessed the whole thing, who just looked at me and kind of went, "Yeah, that just you just blew it. Yeah, that just happened. Congratulations."
You should have followed him in.
Besides, the worst part was that him being in Oxford, he visited the skate park that I spent most of my childhood growing up in, and it's like I should have known that he'd have gone to. Of course, he'd go to the bloody skate park, and I didn't think that he would. So I saw this image of him.
Just camped out.
Yeah, well, that's what a lot of people were just hanging out, and it's where I used to hang out when I was younger, when I was a skateboarder. So like the idea of just all the people that I know just kind of being there on an average day, just kind of not thinking anything, and then all of a sudden Tony Hawk just walks in. No, like there was no advertising, no anything. He just literally rocked up. It would have been the most incredible thing in the world, and I wish I'd have gone. But let's say that I'm at that skate park myself. Here's the problem, right? So like when I was a skateboarder, I would have gone into a shop and I'd have bought a skateboard, and you buy all the parts separately and you put it together, and it's great fun. Now, they can be quite expensive. Like if you want a really good skateboard, put everything together, you're looking at about £160, right? So let's say, for instance, that we've got two options. Either in possible world A, I walk into that skate shop and I've saved up my birthday money. I've got exactly £160, and that skateboard comes to £155. And I think, fantastic, I buy the skateboard. In possible world B, we have taxed skateboarding companies because of the threat that they pose to the NHS because of broken limbs and things. So the cost of that skateboard comes to £170, and I can't afford it, so I don't buy the don't buy the skateboard. In world A, I excitedly jump on my skateboard, roll down the street, and get hit by a car and break my arm and go to the hospital and have to get it fixed, right? Mm-hmm. In possible world B, that does not happen. In other words, we can trace the fact that I am costing the NHS more money because of my decision to buy a skateboard, which would have been mitigated had we taxed the skateboarding company such that it would have disincentivized me to buy the skateboard and then not
break your leg.
break my legs. So either we're in favor of this kind of thinking or we're not. I'm not. I don't think that that's how we should do things. I think that if somebody buys a skateboard and goes and gets hit by a car, I'm more than happy for my 0.00001% of whatever it is of my income going towards fixing their arm than saying something along the lines of, no, I'd rather keep that money for myself or have it go to somebody else, have it go to a cancer patient who didn't get to decide the situation they're in, especially given that, not believing in free will, I don't think that anybody makes these decisions for themselves. And I think we've got to be very careful about deciding who commits a volitional action and who doesn't, not just in a world where there's no free will, but even on a softer level where we say, for instance, the influence of other people. If you live in a culture that's normalized meat eating, you could say that it's not your fault, so to speak, that you've got a diet consisting mostly in meat eating because you're surrounded by family and friends in a culture that says that it's permissible, and it's so ingrained inside you that it's not entirely your fault that you don't have that kind of reservation. In other words, either we take the logic that you're suggesting, Lewis, which I think is justifiable logic, right, in principle. But if we either take it and we realize that it has a whole number of implications, mm-hmm. which I think would actually cripple the idea of a universal nationalized healthcare system, or we just have to kind of grit our teeth. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that if we don't implement this tax, it's because it's unjustified or because we shouldn't do, or because it wouldn't actually be economically beneficial, or rather that it wouldn't that it doesn't make sense. It's not like a sensible argument to say that it would be economically beneficial. I actually kind of agree with all of that. And I do think it's a good idea, morally speaking, and I think that it's justified. I'm just saying that I don't think it leads us where we actually want to go.
See, I'm not going to lie. Like, first thing I'd say that one, we're going to have a conversation on free will at some point. Because obviously, like, my understanding of free will, I'm not a libertarian, obviously. I'm a compatibilist. So obviously we've got very different views on free will. Taking a Hegelian continental stance, I actually think that people are capable of making their own decisions to a degree. Obviously, I believe in things like addiction. I believe in things like psychological impairment. I believe in a whole plethora of mitigating factors on free will, but not hard determinism. So we'd have to discuss that at some point. we'll have to fight that out. In relation to, let's take the skateboard example, the kid who, buys a skateboard. Let's say you bought the skateboard, couldn't afford it, A and B. Obviously, as a utilitarian, I would have thought that you'd have preferred world B, funnily enough. But even if we accepted that we are not going to tax certain sports or sporting behaviors, for example, for the risks, we can agree on what poses an justified and unjustifiable risk in relation to, for example, the damage it can cause. Let's say the entire population had picked up skateboarding. We could probably still cover the costs under the universal healthcare system of everyone breaking their arm once a year. Okay. Could we, on the other hand, cover the cost of 30% of the population needing mechanical ventilation? Probably not. And the point is that the risk is greater, so that we could say that, okay, there are certain risks which are just mitigated by you living in society. We understand that everyone will have a risk imposed upon them to a certain degree. However, if you are increasing risk to such a high factor, then, okay, you're going to have to do something about that, because we simply cannot afford this level of risk in our society. And that your risk is not simply a self-imposed risk, like the child committing the action on the skateboard which gets them hurt, or Tony Hawk or whoever it is, getting hurt on the skateboard, but also the risk towards another individual, like you infect an elderly woman, or you infect a vulnerable asthmatic or something like that with an infection. They do not want the risk in their society. They would rather prohibit the action. They cannot prohibit it because you outnumber them. Now, it's not that it shouldn't be prohibited. It's that democratically, they would not win. It's like, I would definitely ban meat, dairy, and eggs. First on moral grounds, but even if I was to simply apply an anthropocentric moral view, I would say that we should ban meat, dairy, and eggs. I would say that the risk that it poses upon for zoonotic disease risk, the risk that it of destroying our healthcare system through even cholesterol and saturated fat, the costs that it's causing there, and then obviously the damage that it does to slaughterhouse workers psychologically, with causing things like Pitt's disorder and even psychological detachment, alcoholism, insomnia. There are so many psychological detrimental effects of killing that it is even just through perpetration, it is a damaging action. And so I could say, like, through all of those, I would call for an outright ban. The reality of the situation is it simply cannot be prohibited under a democratic state at the moment. We should call for it, but it will not be prohibited. But those costs that it incurs will still occur. And that if we do not hold people accountable, we are still treating them like children. You say that we are treating them like children if we say, eat your greens, be healthy. But is it not more that we are treating them like children when we say it's okay to live in your imagination and pretend that all of these costs simply aren't happening, that your actions don't have consequences, that you do not cause us increased costs?
Well, no one's saying that. No one is saying that we're kind of allowing people to delude themselves into thinking they're not taking a risk. We're just saying that they have the right to take that risk if the risk was posed upon themselves and nobody else. Of course, it's a different question when you consider the risks that impose on other people, but that's not as straightforward as we might think. For example, when Tony Hawk landed the 900, he probably inspired hundreds and hundreds, thousands of kids to pick up skateboarding and to go and probably harm themselves, right? So it's like, it's not quite as straightforward as one person's only harming themselves and somebody else is harming other people as well. Now, the separate point was that even if we kind of accept the logic that I'm putting forward, firstly, you say that maybe I'd prefer world B as a utilitarian. That's not true, because I think that a world in which there's the freedom to skateboard or do whatever you want is better than one where there's not the freedom, but also not the risk. But you said that, well, at the very least, even if we did kind of institute such a tax, we could probably afford everybody picking up skateboarding and breaking their arms. So we wouldn't need to tax it because we can already afford it, whereas we couldn't afford ventilators, so we should be taxing that. Well, is that our measure here? Is it kind of like, if we've got people committing actions like smoking, which are going to harm other people, but we've actually got enough money really to cover the to cover the problem with that? Are we just going to say, well, we're not going to tax smokers, right? Because, yes, they kind of cause a risk to the health service, but not such a big risk that we're not going to be able to cover it. Or is the argument that because they do increase the amount of medical care needed, we're going to increase the cost on them, even if we could cover it already? It's like we shouldn't have to. We shouldn't have to allocate less of our funds to other places. So we're still going to, charge you for more, even though we could cover it. If that's the case, then the distinction you make there, I don't think is relevant, because then in that case, we're discussing whether or not an action should permit us to charge people more, not kind of whether or not it's going to be expensive enough to actually be skin off our backs, and if it is, then we'll charge them, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I understand the difference between like the individual's intention versus the consequences of the action. I totally understand. And I think that the point of what I was trying to say wasn't essentially that we would say that certain actions are permitted simply because we can cover the costs. Although there is an argument there that, that we simply could not permit an action that we couldn't cover the costs, because it might just go beyond our ability to facilitate. But rather that if we agree on a certain baseline risk level that individuals are able to take, and certain risks are permissible, then, and certain risks aren't in terms of economic payouts and so on, towards broader society, may I add. I'm not simply saying taking risk with yourself. Like the skateboarder takes a risk with themselves to hurt themselves. Okay, then they've at least they've hurt one person. We could say, right, fair enough. But you've not actively disadvantaged the broader society as well, which would need compensation. So there's twofold for the tax. There's the fact that the healthcare system will need propped up, and there's also the individual risk you are placing upon others, which needs compensated. You're impeding my liberty in putting me in a risk in a society that produces pandemics. Do you see what I mean? So that there is two points there. And I think I would honestly argue that the second one, that you are putting me at risk, is the strongest. It's the moral hazard. That's the greatest risk. You are impeding my liberty. And the first one, I think, is just a point of practicality. The fact that if you are going to put me at risk, and you are going to have to cover some of the healthcare, we are going to need a healthcare system that covers these risks, and these risks are going to have to pay for themselves. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But we can obviously agree to disagree. Obviously, Jack, do you want to?
Sorry, I was going to say there was a point I kind of wanted to add to what Alex was saying when he was talking about lack of free will and the fact that meat consumption is normalized. And I suppose this kind of links to what you want him to talk about regarding public perception. And it's that I suppose what you're proposing could be seen as a regressive tax, in the sense that it doesn't matter what your income is. If you buy the same amount of meat or the same amount of product, you get the same tax, right? So this means the people hit hardest by this would be the poorest.
Yeah. I actually heard that criticism before I even spoke to you. Somebody just said it. Like, it was PhD friend. He was like, "You are going to hurt the poor, Lewis. You're a socialist." And I was like, "Okay, I understand the point. Like, obviously, especially those that are, if you're buying like a ready meal from Heron, and it contains meat, you're going to get charged. But if and essentially as well, what I'll be saying is that like the point of why I'm standardizing the tax." I'm arguing for a standard tax based on the quantity of meat and variation in type as well, because I think things like pigs are more likely to transmit infection to humans. So there's that issue as well. If you're eating one type of animal over another, I know it's obviously morally disgusting to eat either, but if you're eating one over the other, then you're increasing risk in this regard. So you might pay more for pork or pigs than you would for beef or chicken, right? Or fish, which are much less likely to transmit zoonotic diseases. But the point of I guess I'd make is that it would hurt the poor more to create a tax that would reflect the quality and the conditions of the meat directly against the consumer. One, because if you're unable to make the choice about what quality meat you are buying, then you are going to be hit the hardest. So if you can afford, let's say, free range, organic, having much more space, meat, and it costs much more, you will not get taxed as much, which then actually reduces the cost. So there's a kind of twofold way that you can look at it. Either it would make it would push people towards higher quality products, and that mightn't be possible for certain groups of individuals, or it might simply alienate people from, buying these products. What I would say is that, one, it's the people, these products are unnecessary. We can actually, as a lower class, speaking as an impoverished vegan, we can actually eat, meat. We can be fine without meat, dairy, and eggs, even if we're absolutely broke. So if we say like, oh, well, you're punishing the poor for eating meat, well, no, they're punishing themselves, actually.
But skateboarding is unnecessary as well, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And I think this is the thing. Like, I think that if, let's say, you were to charge people for skateboarding, even with the risk that they're posed upon themselves, which I think is a much, obviously, as I said, a much different risk in the first place, because it's not having an overall impact to society in terms of, you're not going to smack someone over the head with a skateboard.
You're just gonna charge them for you're just gonna make them foot the bill for your medical
broken leg. Yeah, in the same way that you would for a pandemic.
Yeah, but let's literally, well, and the difference with the pandemic,
I'd almost rather somebody. I think I'd rather somebody hit me in the leg with the skateboard than hit themselves in the leg and got me to pay for it.
I think, well, I think the difference is, if there was to tax them, you wouldn't be paying for it. But the thing is that the point is.
But that's true, which you're against, right?
Well,
if we tax them,
I'm not against.
That's the point.
I'm not against charging people at the point of purchase, for example, VAT for the buying of a skateboard. Like,
we don't charge them VAT because of the risk that they're going to pose to the health service.
But we do mitigate VAT on meat, dairy, and eggs.
Right.
So you see, the difference is that we are saying that this is a necessary product. This is an unnecessary product. We could say that the VAT may cover the costs of the skateboard and accident. There is nothing covering the costs of meat, dairy, and eggs.
I think. Sorry, I don't want to take you off to a different point, but I was just writing down my thoughts. Unless Alex wants to reply to that, can I quickly just say something?
Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I think that when you're talking about the different types of animals and how the taxes will vary between them because different animals increase the probability differently, I think you're kind of highlighting the fact that this is such a complex issue with so many different factors. 100%. Not just that, but also the hygiene of the place where they're coming from, or the number of human employees there as well. I mean, I don't really understand zoonotic diseases that much, but there's so many variables in this. It's going to be so unbelievably complicated to try and create a fair tax system like that takes into account these different factors.
100%. I think that the first thing that we need to do is not focus on tax in that respect. I think when we talk about hygiene and welfare, we need to consider humans, for example, slaughterhouse workers need to be distant. I made this argument for the welfare of slaughterhouse workers. I don't think it's fair to place them in an unhygienic environment at all. I think that to place someone who is, who's doing their job into a dangerous scenario, those need to be mitigated with PPE, with procedural changes. That's just workers' rights as a first, and two, if there is no if a company does not comply with workers' rights, I think that we should take action against them, fines, and other economic compensatory measures, and even close them if they are that dangerous. In terms of as you're saying, there's so many things to consider. Absolutely, I actually think this is the hardest thing. This is why I'm proposing that the UK government talk about it. I'm not saying that the UK government implement a certain kind of tax as of yet. I'm just saying that there are these number of issues that need to be raised, because one, we're not speaking about it at all, and two, the ability to produce empirical studies to understand the effect of zoonotic disease risk to overall society and to our healthcare system and to the economy. There's another part I need to bring up. Is something that only something like a government or a centralized agency with a large amount of funding in the first place could actually do. And many of us, I could say, zoonotic diseases are really bad. They create pandemics. I have very little data to supplement that because I simply cannot afford a study. A government can, and it can afford independent studies, which is great. And that's another thing I'd say. And as I said, I don't think that, as I say, that there are certain risks that we can permit, in the sense that we should be willing to permit. And there are certain risks that we say that are impermissible. I think that we could agree that we will cover the cost of sports, because sporting itself is even things like skateboarding is useful form of exercise. It's an expression of liberty, and it only affects an individual. We say, anything that is only going to put yourself at risk, we will cover the costs of, because we respect liberty itself, and the value of liberty takes precedence over anything else, and that is necessary for subjectivity to be expressed in the first place. However, if your expression of liberty and subjectivity is now impeding another's, then I would like to say you're committing a crime. But in many cases, it's like, for example, secondhand smoke. I think if you're smoking around someone who says, "Please do not smoke that around me. We're in a closed space," you're committing a crime, and I would call for a ban. And if I can't move away from you, then that should be banned. And as I say, I think primarily a ban on meat, dairy, and eggs would be far, far more justifiable in that respect. But if a ban is not possible, as in it cannot be done, if we cannot ban meat, dairy, and eggs, which I don't think we can right now, I think that individuals should still be held to the costs of their actions, and that's and towards other individuals.
So why not take the same approach, morally speaking, to the exploitation of animals? I mean, essentially, when we allow the government to tax meat, dairy, and eggs, we're allowing the government to profiteer off the exploitation of animals. And we could say something like, "This is immoral, and ideally we want to ban meat, dairy, and eggs because it's bad for the animals. But since we can't do that, let's just tax them. Let's just have a moral tax. Let's have like reformist policies. It's like, I don't think I'd be in favor of this. It seems like the conversation is morally driven, because we are still talking about people making decisions, and those decisions requiring compensation. But morally, I think I have trouble. It smacks of reform to me to talk about the taxation of animal products. It would be as though it was legal to rape people, and people were being admitted to the healthcare system after being victims of rape, and us saying, look, we should really be taxing rapists because of the costs that they're posing to the NHS. It's like, well, no, we should be stopping them from doing it, not just because of the moral case, but even if we're going to make just a purely economic case about the NHS, it's like, this is bad enough that it's costing enough money to the NHS and is so not worthy of the person committing the crime that we should ban them purely on economic grounds, let alone the whole moral grounds that you've got as well. And I think it would be strange of us to say, if we lived in a world where for some reason we couldn't illegalize it, for us to just start campaigning for a tax on it, because to me that would be morally backwards.
Well, I think they did the same thing with smoking. We did the same thing with alcohol.
But I don't think those things are morally backward in the respect that when somebody's harming their own health with smoking, right, these things aren't as morally backward as something like exploiting an animal, right? And so we tax it. If it is morally backwards in the sense of like forcing other people to inhale your smoke, what do? We ban it.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that the difference is that each institution of our society and our overall culture relies upon an anthropocentric moral view in current times. Individuals do not see animals as morally considerable for the most part, otherwise they would just be vegan in the first place. And we wouldn't even need a ban, because people would be acting as immorally. And in a democratic environment, if the majority of the population became vegan, then we could ban it, because sentientism is the dominant cultural ideology. And so we would be justified to ban it. The issue is that when we say that it's about the animals in a society that doesn't care about the animals, then what we are doing is imposing politically a moral rationality which cannot be justified. Now, what I'd say is that I'm not saying that we can't justify it rationally. I absolutely agree. I think that when you look at metaethics upwards from the very ground up, you should come to the conclusion that you should be a sentientist and we should ban meat, dairy, and eggs. I absolutely agree. The difference is that I suppose the difference is that we could call for that ban. That's fine. I agree. But that's going to require the education of the individuals to a certain degree, and individuals are going to have to progress to that point. And, overall democracy will take its course. Hopefully, and at least I very much hope so.
But this is why we should live, instead of living in a democracy, we should be living in a constitutional republic modeled after the US system, but with slightly better design from the ground up to include protection of animals. I think that if we did that, we don't need a democratic majority to protect the freedom of speech or the freedom of religion, and there was no vote taken at the founding of the United States. It was instituted in the Constitution, and when this country republicanizes and becomes a constitutional republic with no monarch, I think that we should protect the rights of animals in the Constitution as well, and we should say that this isn't a matter up for democratic debate. This is a matter of rights, and I think that would solve our problem so much. So, because you say, we're not going to be able to install it democratically, perhaps I agree with you, but this is a better way of doing it. So it seems that not only are you against the NHS, you're also against democracy.
Oh, I'm against republicanism. Absolutely.
Small r republicanism.
Can I just make a little probe of something that Alex has said? So, forgive me if I'm not saying what you said here, but did you say that you're for taxing products that harm others, but you're not for taxing products? Sorry, you're for taxing products that harm others, right? But you're not taxing. You don't want to tax products that only harm yourself.
Not quite. I said what we do right now is we tax products that harm ourselves and we ban products that harm other people. I think that's half right. I think if something is harming other people to the extent that it's unjustified, then it should be banned, because that's just the harm principle in action. But I don't think we should tax people for harming themselves, even though that will cost the NHS, because of the lines of thought that it takes us down. So I don't think people should be taxed for. I think potentially we could say that people should. Yeah, I don't think so. No, okay. I could imagine a situation in which maybe it would make sense to tax people for a certain action rather than banning it, but I don't think that this is one of them.
I think. Do you not worry that the idea of establishing a republican constitution without the overall what's the word I'm looking for, the sanction of the UK population would be authoritarian?
Well, I mean, if you want authoritarianism, look no further than the monarchy, and it's I don't know.
I know, and we should have definitely executed them. I don't know why they're still around.
No, just we don't need to go quite that far.
I wouldn't actually hurt anyone. As a disclaimer, please, no one try and assassinate the Queen.
Look, I quite like the Queen. I just don't like the institution she represents. Let's say. The point that I'm trying to get at is that there are two arguments and discussions to be had here. There's a principled ethical one, and there's a kind of pragmatic economic one. If we take the principled moral approach, it's like we need to ban this. I think we're all in agreement with that. But what we're talking about is the pragmatic economic implications of this. But we're still clinging on to ideas of morality when trying to think pragmatically and economically by saying something like, well, look, if somebody else commits an act which causes someone I love to be harmed, damn right, I think they should pay for it. It's like, I think that's... let's be careful here. Are we basing this argument on morality, or are we basing this argument on economics? I don't think we're basing it on economics, because I don't think we're saying that person is, and I'm not saying we should do. I'm just bear with me. I'm sorry. Like, if we're making a moral case, which I think is what we're doing when we say, like, yeah, that person should pay. As I say, the moral case that we make should be one for the banning of these products, right? If we're thinking about it economically and pragmatically, then I don't think it makes sense to say something like, yeah, damn right, they should pay for it. I think that's a moral point rather than an economic, pragmatic one.
I think that's absolutely nonsensical, because I think we don't divorce economics and morality, because that's the whole, I'm saying this as a socialist, as I say it, the idea of divorcing people's economics and what is economics if not a trade in the respect of the ethical property rights of an individual? The fact that I respect you as a property owner and as equal to me is the foundation of society as a whole, and economics is just an aspect of that. I think what we'd be talking about is alienating individuals from the costs of their actions upon other individuals. What I'm saying is that if we take the dominant anthropocentric moral view, which is the dominant rationality of our contemporary society, that we should come to the conclusions that there should be at least a tax on these products. As vegans, I say that we should advocate for a ban, absolutely, because we should try and become the dominant ideology. Because I feel that if you run anthropocentric morality to its course, you'll find that it leads to sentientism. But that's a meta-ethical argument, and it's something that will progress hopefully through time institutionally. But contemporarily, our institutions are in disarray for not charging a tax, because the tax itself is simply the mitigation of harm against another human, which we already agree has rights and value. Now, you're saying to imply a constitutional democracy and impose animal rights foundationally. That seems unjustified. What you're trying to do is force moral progress, which is no moral progress at all. You're trying to tell people what is right and wrong rather than them have the rationality embedded in their institutions, which leads them to the conclusions of right and wrong. This is a form of heroic morality, which would overall undermine the progression of sentientist moral approaches. It will overall force people to regress back into an anthropocentric view and reject you as an authoritarian governor determining what they should and should not do. All I'm saying is that people should take responsibility for their decisions. You're the one saying that people shouldn't be allowed to make the decisions.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not in favor of forcibly instituting a constitutional republic. As much as I'd like to see the day, I don't think it should be forcibly. I do think that if such a progression were to be made, it would need to be made democratically. But the only people I've ever met who are more stubborn, like in their love, than people who love animals, are people who love the monarchy. So I think that if we manage to get to a point where people are able to get rid of that cherished institution, I think that we'll have already solved the problem of animal rights. So maybe that's a problem to be addressed down the line. But look, I mean, that aside, like, obviously we, as is said, we live in a democracy, and I agree with you that we're going to need to take democratic measures here. And the question is whether kind of the effort of convincing people that eating animal products is really bad, like it's really bad for your health and for the health of other people. It's so bad, in fact, that we should actually be mitigating the costs by taxing people. You have to get a majority of people to agree with that in order to institute a tax democratically. But if you can get people to agree that animal products are really, really bad, like really bad, and they're harming everybody else, but you've also got people to agree that, you know, things are really bad, like smoking, and if smoking is really bad, they're really, really bad for other people, we should probably ban it. And people go, yeah, I reckon so. It's like, if we're going to get to the point that we have to get to institute this tax, convincing a majority of the population that animal products are as bad as they are, then we'd have a population that is far more amenable to a ban than I think you're perhaps suggesting or allowing.
Well, I think that we don't necessarily have to, have to go around the streets and campaign for this tax simply to every individual and have an election on it. I think foundationally in our state, we agree that the government can induce taxes for these purposes. We already agree that if an individual is if we were to say that the purpose of tax is to allow for the greatest expression of freedom and subjectivity within society, so that you may act as a free individual unimpeded by the actions of another, and that this tax is to compensate any trespass or overall damage that someone could cause to you, or greater society, and for the allowing of greater society to function and flourish, then that's what taxation is. And so when they have agreed to tax, and I think everyone for the most part almost entirely agrees with tax and the rationality behind taxes, but we'll talk about it.
Not I, the libertarian. Look, you said that the people have kind of agreed that the government has the right to tax people. Okay.
A fair tax,
right?
And I think
not exactly true. I mean, in order for a tax to be instituted, a majority of MPs have to be in favour of it. We're still talking about a majority of people who are, ostensibly representatives of the people. We live in a parliamentary democracy that has parliamentary sovereignty, which means that if a majority of parliamentarians wanted to ban meat, even if the entire population was against them, our legal system would mandate it, right? Like, the legal system that we live in that allows us to say something like, well, if the government wants to institute a tax, then they can, because we live in a parliamentary democracy and we've agreed to the terms that say that if Parliament wants to institute a tax, then they can. That same process leads us to the conclusion that if Parliament decided to impose a ban, that would be, like, Parliament is sovereign, that would pass, the Queen would sign the bill, as long as, she still is around, and it would go into law.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in favour of that at all, because I think that's undemocratic.
But do we not see how it's the same thing? So if the majority of the population were against the tax and Parliament instituted the tax, then it would be equally undemocratic. In other words, what we'd have to do to make it a fair tax, to make it more democratic, is to convince a majority of the population that the tax is a good one.
I think sorry.
What I was going to say was that a public perception of taxes can change significantly and quickly after a tax has been implemented. So if we look at the tax on plastic bags in England, my parents were fuming about paying a few pence for a plastic bag. They were fuming. And we saw significantly, even within 1 month after the tax was introduced, significant improvement in how people feel about the tax, and a significant reduction in plastic bag use as well. So I do think that the tax, it may sound stupid, but implementing the tax can also be used as a form of education. Tax as education, spoken like a true socialist. In the sense that their views can change significantly after it's introduced.
True, but that's not the. I think that may have been the case with plastic bags, because people, the realization was not so much kind of actually no, this tax is a good thing because it is gonna benefit the economy and it is gonna save the environment. It's kind of more like a, actually, I really don't need that many plastic bags. It's because it's plastic bags, right? If you try to tax something more important, like I don't know, tea or something, you might be in a little bit more trouble. I think if you tax something that people consider to be important, then you might end up with some revolutionaries on your hands.
I do think that the point of what I'm trying to make is that it's a justified tax, and I think that, like, obviously, you could campaign the streets and so on. And it's not that I'm saying that we actively enforce it and from a legislator which cannot be held accountable, because that is against everything in which I stand for. That there is an issue in our society that our legislators cannot be held accountable for the legislation that goes through. I mean, I think you pointed that out. The fact that if the MPs wanted to make a decision, they make the decision, we are held accountable. That's what's happened. That's not democracy. I mean, we don't live in a democracy, really. Like, we say we do, but we know we don't.
Well, not as anybody. I mean, there is
of course. No, there hasn't been a direct democracy since Athens or anything. So, like, really, and if we can even call that a democracy. So the reality is that democracy's never happened, and hopefully it will happen one day. But the point of what I'm saying is that, we need mechanisms to hold legislators accountable, but let's say we all agree from the foundation of our state that we agree with tax, and we all agree that there is a fair the deliberative process which determines what is a justified and unjustified tax, which we all agree for. But we don't say that, we wouldn't say that one tax is justified, the other tax isn't, because that relieves it to subjectivity. We wouldn't say, but I actually don't like the idea of taxing plastic bags, or actually I don't really like the idea of taxing one product and not another, simply because it affects my life. Really, taxation is justified on the grounds of taxation itself, not on the product being taxed. It's justified on the relationship between individuals, not on the grounds of individual products. That was the point I was trying to make. So in terms of the idea of taxing meat, dairy, and eggs, okay, it could be massively unpopular. Individuals might absolutely riot. And you know what, it mightn't even get put through, because it would be, like, the overall individuals might want to be irrational. But the point is that, like, we could do the same thing with tobacco, alcohol, road tax, all of it. Every single individual who gets taxed, nobody wants to get taxed. Nobody wants to get taxed on anything. But we can say that there is justifiable taxes, and that if you agree with taxation, you agree with the foundation of taxation, the rational bedrock of taxation, not how it's expressed on an individual point-by-point case.
I really genuinely don't understand how you don't see the exact same argument applying to a ban. It's the exact same thing. We've agreed that the government has the right to restrict certain activities. And so, like, we agree with the principle that the government can restrict certain activities.
In relation to what, though?
Well, it's the same question can be asked of tax, right? We've agreed on the principle of tax, but tax in relation to what? Like, it's the same thing. Some people will be for certain taxes, some people will be against certain taxes, but you seem to be suggesting...
I mean the end of a ban. What is the purpose of a ban? I think the purpose of a ban in our contemporary anthropocentric moral view is to help humans. I think the purpose of a ban against animal products for the sake of the animals is to help animals. Something which is not included in the cultural moral view of our society, and so would be unjustified. You are acting with unjustification. You're not justified. You're acting as a sovereign. Then you're not acting democratically, expressing the will of the people.
We might be, I don't know if we're talking past each other here, but it's like you said that the tax is justified and people have agreed with the principle of taxation. It's like, well, I think that the ban is justified. I also think it's true that people have agreed with the prospect of the government being allowed to ban things. It's the exact same thing.
No, I think maybe we are, because what I'm saying is that people have agreed with the rational foundation of tax.
People have agreed with the rational foundation of banning things.
I agree. But in both senses, I think they've agreed it on anthropocentric grounds. They say, I have agreed with this because human life is valuable.
Right. So when the government institutes a tax, like an environmental tax, are people able to say, look, I didn't sign up for this?
I think if the government introduced an environmental tax that wasn't done on the grounds of anthropocentric moral view in contemporary society, absolutely. I think if someone let's say,
but look,
if they introduce something like, we really need to care about rivers, like Leopold's land ethic, if they were to say we need to care about rivers themselves, the mountains, the trees, the air we breathe has value, that's nonsense.
Yeah, but look,
to me, and I would absolutely revolt against that tax.
But the ban that we'd be instituting would be anthropocentrically originated, because we're banning it on the grounds of the harm that it will cause to the human population and the economic catastrophe that it could potentially cause. So, in other words, if you're going to say people have agreed with taxation on anthropocentric grounds, and here we have a tax that's justified, so it should go through. I'm saying people have agreed with the prospect of the government banning things on anthropocentric grounds, and here is a ban, if we ban animal products on anthropocentric grounds of preventing, pandemic catastrophe.
Disease risk, yeah.
It's the same thing, surely.
I would agree.
Voila. Okay. I'm glad we're in agreement. But that means, in other words, the point that I'm trying to make with that is that if we justify the tax, then we've justified the ban.
I would agree there. As I said, I would much prefer a ban. I think even on those grounds, I would agree. I think the issue is that,
okay, but sorry, can we just take this back to the point that was originally being made then, which was this? We said the problem is that the ban would be undemocratic, right? We need to make it democratic. And I said, but the tax would also have to be democratic.
Then it would be democratic.
And you said no, it's not, because we've agreed on a system where even if most people are against the tax, we agree on a system where if Parliament wants to tax people, they're allowed to. And I'm saying, well, even if most people are against the ban, we've agreed on a system where Parliament can ban things, and therefore, if they do so, even if it's undemocratic, it would still be, at least, it would be as unjustified.
But they're on the same ground. We'd have to agree that it would have to be on an anthropocentric grounds.
Yes, which is the basis of the conversation we're having. Because obviously, I think it goes without saying that we would all much rather ban animal products for the sake of the animals. But this conversation is specifically about the medical cost of animal consumption to human beings. And I think that if that's the case, then either both have to be democratic, or both can not be democratic.
I would agree. I think it would just be I guess the reason I'm proposing a tax is perhaps my lack of faith that a ban would be implemented. Like, tax, I think, could be implemented. A ban, although I would prefer it, even on anthropocentric grounds. I've actually talked about that. I think you should even be vegan on anthropocentric grounds. Even if you only care about people, you should still not eat meat, dairy, and eggs. That is the correct. You should ban it. But the problem is that the majority of the population would see that as a direct invasion of their civil liberties.
Can I just add that I thought that the main reason that they introduced a plastic bag tax was because of the environment and the wildlife. It wasn't related to humans primarily.
But I think that the overall, like, let's be honest, I think with our contemporary society, I think the only reason that we care about the environment in the first place is because we live in it.
You could say that, yes, but I think when they educated the public as to why they were doing it, they talked about the environment and the actual animals who live there and wildlife, and turtles who were being killed by plastic bags.
Yeah, but that's the thing. They say that got turtles being killed by plastic bags, but will appeal to someone's feelings towards turtles. We go, you really like the aesthetic, of a turtle. and we don't want that to go extinct, because then you'll be harmed by the fact that you won't be able to look at turtles anymore.
But the same is true of an ethical case against animal consumption, because being something of an egoist myself, I would technically have to say that that my view of animals and their liberation is actually for my own sake rather than for their sake, because I just can't stand the fact to see them in cages. It's like, I can make the same point. I could say we're going to tax animal products on the grounds of animal exploitation, because you care about animals, we love animals, and it would really suck for us if we knew that these poor animals are being kept in horrible situations.
Didn't I tell you why egoism was wrong?
You tried to. You thought you did anyway.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really seeing the distinction between a plastic bag tax for wild animals and a meat tax for farmed animals.
I think this is the thing. Like, I think that most people, like Alex is saying that it's for him in this scenario, and if we say that everyone's an egoist in this respect, I think that this is kind of how society treats her. It treats her as individuals who have certain preferences, and those preferences are respect as expressions of our subjectivity, and expressions of our subjectivity sometimes involve other beings which are not human. So, dolphins, whales, polar bears, the ice caps, mountains. It's not that we care about mountains, it's that we care about people caring about mountains. It's not that we care about animals, it's that we care about people caring about animals. And I think that we could say the same thing, except the majority of the population does not care to the extent in which they would ban meat, dairy, and eggs. Otherwise, they wouldn't be purchasing meat, dairy, and eggs.
No, people could have said the same thing before they introduced the plastic bag tax, couldn't they?
I suppose they could. What people, I think, who genuinely did care about plastic bags to the point in which they are willing to not use them, as in they're unjustified, they wouldn't have used them in the first place. The tax would be unnecessary for most people.
So potentially, I think that a point that could be taken from what Jack's saying is that potentially your argument would say that the plastic bag tax is unjustified if done on environmental grounds. Which is fine. That's a fine position that
I would 100% take that. Yeah.
But
you think it was unjustified?
Yeah.
And I thought you were also suggesting that there's like the practical issue of the public perception of it, where people will go crazy because it's not related to humans. Whereas what we're saying is actually they've been okay with it in the past, so why wouldn't they be okay with it this time?
I would definitely agree with Alex though in this, that I think that it's a very distant notion from being closer to home. Like as in, like, if you were to tax tea, I think we're referencing the Boston Tea Party and the Americans there. It becomes a much greater issue that my tea, and people going crazy, or me hamburger, whatever it is. That's much closer to home. It becomes a much more prevalent issue. People were annoyed at a 5p tax. Annoyed at 5p on plastic bags. Everyone thinks plastic bags are bad. Like, we know they're bad, but we still were annoyed for the most part that there was a 5p tax.
So how annoyed are people going to be when you try and institute a tax on meat consumption? That every time you go to Frankie and Benny's, that they're going to charge you like to hell for having a pepperoni pizza. So people are going to be very, very annoyed.
Absolutely.
And what are they going to say? They're going to say these damn vegans and their ridiculous authoritarian tendencies. And it's not a frivolous consideration. It's going to be bad PR, right? And if the end goal is banning animal products, then it's like, as you said before, like, you're going to have a better chance convincing the hearts and minds of individuals than, like, in the same way that you said, look, people are going to see you as an authoritarian if you try to institute rights. It's like, well, I think the rights should be instituted, but you said, but if you try and institute them in this way, Alex, like with your revolutionary republicanism, then you're going to be an authoritarian. People aren't going to get aboard your cause. There's going to be protests and people aren't going to like what you're doing. Well, the exact same thing is true if we try to just institute this tax without winning over the hearts and minds. Now, if we win over the hearts and minds of people such that they agree with the tax, what that means is we have a majority population who agrees that animal products are really bad. If we have that situation, then we have a situation in which we can campaign for a ban instead of a tax.
But sometimes people will agree that a product is bad and harmful, but then not agree with prohibition, which is alcohol, tobacco, and many other things. I think the whole point of what I'm saying is that it's a lot easier to get people to agree with a tax than it is a ban.
No, I don't think this is true.
To say that I there is a difference in saying I expect you to pay the price for your actions than I expect you to not commit this action. And I think the majority of the population will be more willing to be in favor of a tax in that respect. Also, I think that in relation to the education of the population and so on, I agree that is the general way that we should go. I think that is 100% the way we should go. And I think that's why all of us do what we do. I mean, like, obviously, Humane Hancock, Jack, you actively try and educate the population on the streets day by day. You know, you Alex, you've made speeches and videos on and debates on education against meat, dairy, and eggs. And obviously, I try and do the same. And I think, and obviously, some of my PhDs about. But the point I'm making is not that we should give up education. Is that, if anything, this is the perfect opportunity to at least get people talking about the overall detrimental effects that meat, dairy, and eggs have. I mean, people don't even consider that it's meat, dairy, and eggs that are causing these pandemics.
I think that's a good point. I think it's really, really great for us to use this to our advantage and try and educate people about what's happening. Like, for instance, Ed Winters has made some really good videos on this topic, educating people, so we can kind of use it to ultimately reduce the consumption of animals and save animals' lives. But that's different to saying that it should be taxed. If we say that, okay, yes, there needs to be education, we should use this to educate people on these topics that people don't know enough about, that they should know more about, that doesn't mean it should necessarily be taxed, right?
I think there's two ways I look at the tax. One, it makes it like more personal. If I say that you should be taxed for your action, you go, no, I shouldn't, and it brings it home. If I say you should be vegan, right? Okay, I say that I'm going to Nando's. A lot of the time you can't just get outright dismissed. It's a lot harder to dismiss someone who says, actually, based on your own ethical views as a human, you are actively disadvantaging me. And it's just to bring around the human cost as well. Another thing I would want to obviously bring up with the taxation of these things is not just healthcare costs, but the cost of to slaughterhouse workers. I think one of the biggest things this is a separate issue. One of the biggest things I think we need to recognize is just the overall detrimental effect that slaughterhouse workers receive. I think it's, especially since they're low income most of the time, low income families. Some 60% of slaughterhouse workers in the UK aren't from the UK. So these people, a lot of the times, they don't have a choice. And I think that needs to be considered. There is a human cost. There are human casualties to these decisions. And that's what I was trying to kind of demonstrate with this idea of a tax. I think individuals are more likely to be in favor of a tax, a prohibition upon action, rather than a prohibition. One, I think that they'll say that it respects the individual's decision-making process, that they are able and culpable for their own decisions and their own moral decisions, because this isn't the dominant ideology. And even if it was the dominant ideology, I think that if 40% of the population, or 49% of the population, because 51% of the population are eating meat and the other 51% are abstaining, to say that we are enforcing that upon a ban on 49% of the population is borderline civil war. The very similar thing happened with the prohibition of slavery. And then, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Abraham Lincoln was not right in going to war with the South to liberate the slaves in the plantations, and that a tax would have been anywhere near justified. They just taxing them all. You're hurting us in the North with all these slaves, economically, which they were, and probably more why the war actually happened. But that's me being a cynic. But the point is that I think that people aren't going to be willing to take such drastic actions at this stage. And I think if we can get people talking at least about taking action, at least get people recognizing that there is a fundamental cost to this process, and hopefully maybe eventually generate income which can prevent people from dying and suffering at the hands of this catastrophe, of these calamities, then all the better.
I would just like to add that in disagreement again, if you say people are more in favor of a tax than a ban because they think it respects kind of individual freedom, it's like, well, then they've misunderstood the point, because it's not about respecting individual freedom, because we don't respect individuals' freedom to cause death to other people, right? We respect people's individual decisions to kind of harm themselves. In other words, if you tax sugar, that's going to be more effective than banning it, because people will say, no, you're respecting my individual decision, right? Which is like, yeah, that's the whole point. That's why we don't ban sugar, because that would be absolutely absurd. I think that it would be absurd still to tax it in many ways, because it's essentially the same kind of thing. It's the same kind of justification. It's state paternalism. But if somebody says, well, I guess I'm okay with taxing animal products because that still respects my choice, it's like, well, then you're missing the point, because it's not about your choice to harm yourself. It's about the well-being of other people. And we either agree that if somebody commits an unnecessary action that carries a risk of potentially killing an unwilling participant, that we ban that, or we don't.
I'm don't get me wrong. I do agree ban is a better option, as I say. But I think the difference is the rationality in which you assume the individual will be partaking, as in like the risk-reward ratio an individual is willing to allow for a society to exercise, like an individual in the society to exercise, like as in, is this risk reward ratio justified? Are you allowed to put people in this amount of risk, like driving a car places someone at a risk, like you are increasing risk of road accidents, but we think that's a justifiable risk. You're allowed to drive cars. Smoking, we think, is a justifiable risk to your own health and even to broader society if you pay a certain proportion of the damages. That's how I see the meat, dairy, and eggs tax. It's that people, I cannot tell you that the risk is unjustified, and that this pandemic level threat is absolutely unjustifiable, because then I'm imposing a form of rationality and a form of risk reward ratio which is embedded within my own conceptual thinking. And in as such, if I was to say that this justifies a ban, it goes even further. You see, I would be saying that
I just wanted to make the point that, like, I know what you're saying when you say that you agree with the ban. You think it would be better. You just don't think it would be practicable because people are more amenable to attacks. I'm saying that if people are more amenable to attacks, then they've misunderstood the justification. Because if somebody's in a situation where they're like, okay, I could do a tax but not a ban, then they've misunderstood the whole point. That's what I'm saying.
I completely disagree. I think the difference is the respective different rationalities coexisting in the same society. That there are different institutional rationalities which allow for different risk-reward ratios, but that we all respect each other's decision to have certain risk-reward ratios and certain, certain decision-making processes, and that in each case, if I think this is unjustified and I don't want to be in the society that produces this risk, but you do, that we have to coexist and compromise in some way or another.
Sure. I mean, it's something that's going to require more reflection from me than I think I could permit it now. But hopefully, at least people listening can think about. But I'll certainly think about it more. If there's potentially, but I don't think it's. I mean, it's interesting and relevant, but it kind of, we are in agreement that a ban is a good thing, that a tax would be easier to implement. I think we agree on both of those things. I think the point of disagreement that you and I have, Lewis, is on whether those who are in favor of a tax but not in favor of a ban have actually kind of understood the justification, and whether a tax being easier should actually be done. I think those are the points of disagreement and agreement. That's what I've kind of discerned here.
Yeah, I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I think that I definitely agree with a lot of what you've said. I think there's a lot of reasoning behind it. I think there's a lot of well-founded reasons, which is pretty much why I invited you, to be honest. Because I know that you're capable of, you and Jack are both capable of being, critical thinkers. I don't know why your meta-ethics look the way they do, but you're both very capable thinkers, and that's kind of like obviously why we're here. As the only thing I'd like to, like, before we're kind of round this, just to bring it into a full close, is moving away from individual tax, like the sin tax, which is what we've spent most of the time discussing, because I think that's the most controversial aspect. And if we're to talk about the tax on corporations doing perhaps less safe farming methods, so like putting more animals into smaller spaces, unsanitary environments, feeding animals antibiotics, practices like these, how would you feel about a tax on these practices.
If you're still talking about a moral tax, I think it's still got to be a case. I think I'm committed logically to the position that it's either ban it or tax it equally.
Right. So you would say that there are certain practices which we would simply prohibit, and that what we would do then instead, like let's say we were to allow the consumption of animal products, and let's say we even come to that conclusion that this is what's going to happen in society, that we should simply ban certain practices like factory farming.
Yes.
Okay, I think I'd probably agree with that. I think that would probably be fair enough.
Because if the alternative would just to be allow people to continue factory farming and we tax them for it, well, it's like, would they recognize that they're going to make more money even if they have to pay the tax if they're able to produce more animals, so they'll do it anyway. It's like, I think we'd just be better off banning it, of course.
Of course. Jack?
Sorry. Yeah, to be honest, I'm more unsure now than I was before the conversation on this issue. I think for me, I guess I'm still concerned with all the practical issues, and I suppose my lack of knowledge with economics and taxes, and in regards to the pandemic fund of zoonotic diseases. So I'm not sure, and I still have that little issue of giving people an incentive to buy more of a product that we don't want them to buy because it's going to fund something that they care about, like the NHS or
but also I think that most people would I think if you were to say that it's a tax, I think people are normally decentivized by taxes. I think plastic bags, for example, are a good example. Plastic bag sales drop.
I did have a look at some public perception research on a potential meat tax, and there was like focus groups. I don't know how accurate these things are really, but and how reliable they are. But it would suggest people were suggesting that it wouldn't affect the amount of meat they bought. They would still eat as much meat as before, they'd just be poorer.
I think that would also run the risk of the people that say these things are the people that, like, I think you on the street who are just like, I will buy twice as much meat if you
don't tax me. I'll eat more. Yeah.
I think that's possible. I think obviously it is something to be considered. I think I just want to get the conversation going, at least a tax ban, whatever it may be. It's certainly something needs to happen. I think that we certainly cannot tolerate pandemic level threats for society. I think we can all agree on that, at least, that this is demonstrated that now, I mean, the fact that none of us can leave our houses right now, that this is a serious issue that affects humans as well as animals, and that we really need to at least start conversations on this. I suppose I think that brings it to a close, unless there's anything anyone else would like to kind of add in.
I would just say, Lewis, if you feel this strongly, there is you can go on the government website and you can voluntarily pay more tax if you like.
I don't eat meat, dairy, and eggs though, so I'm not morally culpable.
Well, maybe you should start, because we need more ventilators.
I was going to say, like, I think that's the thing. I think that people could use perverse rationality. I think people could delude themselves into thinking they are doing the moral good.
I don't think that's delusional, because like it may well produce more ventilators. I made a video. One of the first videos that but I mean, if you consider the direct effect of giving money to the amount of ventilators you can get compared to the risk of contracting another disease, it might balance out. I made a video years ago criticizing a homophobic video from the Watchtower, the Jehovah's Witness organization, and this was before my channel had taken off in any respect. So I usually got maybe 100 views, and I basically said at the end of the video, now listen, for every dislike this video gets, I'm going to donate £10 to the LGBT Health and Wellbeing Society. Of course, that had to be the video that is now my most viewed video on the YouTube channel, which means that over 1 million people have now seen it, which means that not only that, but if you look at the dislike bar, it's much larger. Now, I don't know why people still think I'd be paying this £10 donation. I don't know if they've added up the numbers and realized how much money that would be me donating, and that I've cut it off now. But the point is that, like, people who liked the video were disliking the video because I hadn't thought about it enough, and I'd accidentally incentivized them to act like homophobes, because they said, well, if I act like a homophobe, he's going to donate the money, and that would actually be a good thing. In the same way, if we start taxing people for animal products, we're going to incentivize them to act like meat eaters, even though they want the opposite effect. That's just a thing to consider, which Jack brought up at the beginning, and I think is definitely one of the more important points to be thinking about.
I see it as an important point. I do disagree with the notion, though, because I do think that individuals buying something like meat, I think that if you wouldn't tell them that it was to fund the NHS in general, I think you would say that this is to mitigate the harm that you are causing. It'd be like, it's kind of like the same thing with tobacco. People who buy cigarettes aren't like, oh, I'm funding the NHS. They're typically like, all right, yeah, it costs a lot of money to smoke.
Yeah,
and I think we'd need to make clear, like, and I think this is about public education, that the costs of like, take this, like, we could make this tax, and it, like, even if it was a considerable tax, even if it was the 20% VAT on all animal products, I guarantee you we will still be paying that 350 billion we're injecting into the economy right now back for a long time. Like, they're not making money, like, at all. And I think that's something that we would want to make clear in this tax, and in the idea of the tax.
The point that you made a second ago by saying, well, we need to make clear that our justification isn't, to just incentivize giving us money, but specifically to mitigate the cost. It's like, yeah, people can be well aware of that, but still kind of make the kind of brain box idea, the big brain idea, and say, well, this is actually going to do more. In the same way that when I made this video, I didn't say, hey, by the way, if you dislike this video, I'm going to donate some money. I said, by the way, if you're a homophobe, if you dislike this video, that indicates that maybe you have homophobic tendencies. And to mitigate your homophobia, I'm going to pay money to the Health and Wellbeing Society. It wasn't like, hey, dislike and I'll give them some money. It was like, look, if you're a homophobe, I'm gonna count up the homophobes, and I'm gonna mitigate your actions by paying them. But people still went,
right.
Well, hold on, I'm not a homophobe, but if I act like a homophobe, then he's going to pay more money. And I just think the same thing's going to happen here. Or could happen.
That's a really good analogy, actually. I quite like that.
I don't think that, I'd really just very much doubt people would do that. I think that comes down to, like, I think people won't see it as funding the NHS to produce ventilators to mitigate COVID. I think people.
You say this, but because of Alex's video a few years ago, people out on the street like calling gay people names now. Like, he's destroyed lives.
So, like a true socialist, Lewis, I think you just have too high a regard of human nature.
Oh, you're talking to a continental about human nature. You just absolutely triggered. I don't even believe in human nature, man, in a robust sense. I think the point I would say is that humans are the environment they're raised in, for the most part, and that's kind of what I'm considering. I think that the average British person who would buy, when they regard tax, they regard it negatively. I don't think they want to fund the NHS more. They're already thinking they're funding them too much, and they complain about, the government's taking my money. I don't think they're gonna be at all incentivized to buy meat for the NHS. I think that.
Do you think that the NHS could want people to buy more meat? If they need more ventilators?
That's my real fear. That's my real fear.
Yeah, do you think the government will latch onto it? The government will make it a TV ad. TV ad, please do your bit for the NHS. Please buy some more steaks.
No, that would be the genuine. No, that would be my genuine fear of this, and it's a genuine fear, and it's a genuine critique of sin tax as a whole, or any taxation as a whole, is that it gives a perverse incentive to the government, which is ironic because the government are the ones that come up with the idea of perverse incentives.
Hold on, you said any tax. It's definitely a point about any sin tax, absolutely, because you're incentivizing, but like. It's not the case of any tax, because of course if it's just a tax on something just totally banal like the sale of a book or something, then
it gives an incentive for them to push certain sales if they can get more sales.
Then it's like, yeah, but if we're just talking about kind of amoral products, that's a good thing, because the government has an incentive to push trade and make people be buying things and have a healthy economy. The criticism that if you tax this thing, then it's bad because it will make people buy it. It only applies when we're applying the tax specifically because it's a bad or immoral or economically.
I absolutely disagree there. I think that the government introducing themselves that way into an economic system is absolutely disgraceful, influencing the spending habits of people to generate more income for themselves so that they can, do whatever it is that they want with it. I think that can be utterly harmful because the government can't predict the outcomes that their spending habits will have. I think that kind of economic uncertainty and that economic control I think, is the problem. I think that the government shouldn't be able to tell you what you spend your money on in the first place, as in like they shouldn't be like, please buy more meat or please buy a car or whatever it is. The fact that the government is doing that in the first place, I find morally disgraceful.
You think they should be telling people to buy less meat?
I think they should be telling
which is implicit in the tax.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's just the same. That's the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the point I'm saying is that, like, if the government shouldn't be, the government in the tax, if they're saying please buy less meat, they're not saying like please buy less meat. I don't think they should necessarily even be saying that. I think that what they should be saying is that in the tax, that if you do buy meat, this is the relationship you hold with the other citizens in society to mitigate the risk reward ratio that you deem suitable.
Yeah. Okay. So the government doesn't say, hey, please buy more cars. It just says, but hey, if you do buy a car, we're going to give you a sweet deal. We're going to do this really good thing for you or something. Like, it's like it's the same thing.
No, I don't believe that the government should be influencing the spending habits of individuals beyond the fact that they mitigate the risk reward ratio, the trade of individuals. The whole point of in terms of like an Aristotelian understanding of government, for example, is simply to understand that government is there to make sure that trades are fair, that we are respecting individuals as property owners, as equal sovereign individuals, and that is all I see government as for. I think
make a great libertarian.
Oh, I'm a libertarian socialist. That's yeah. So it seems it's
contradiction in terms. It seems
I'll send you a taxation is theft T-shirt.
That's the thing. Like, I actually, most people, like, in grounding, I mean, I would much prefer an anarchy. In many ways, like, well, a minarchy. And taxation only when necessary. I still believe in, universal healthcare and things like that, which people think I'm fucking crazy for. But essentially, I do believe in minimal government, and I do believe in minimal influence from governmental organizations, and I also believe in minimal conglomeration and monopolization from governing bodies, as to allow for the greatest amount of democracy that a society can have, both politically and economically. And I think that's just to respect individual subjectivity. But I mean, unless you just want to have a debate with us over me politically.
Yeah, no, I think this is going on forever. I think it's going forever. But it's been fun. It's been enlightening and interesting.
Yeah, you probably think I'm absolutely crazy now, but it's
not at all.
Half truths.
No, I mean, we're all fighting the same cause here in more or less the same respect.
Yeah, and I understand that Lewis hasn't got any free will, so I don't judge you. You're not responsible for your actions. And that's why I wouldn't want to tax punishing you for your behavior.
See, I totally understand. except I don't have free will, therefore I can't help but think that we should tax everyone for everything.
Yeah, no, in so many words, what we're saying, you can't help being wrong. It's not your fault. It's okay.
Obviously, thank you guys for coming on. It's been good. It's been really good. Just closing statements. Thank you everyone for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Please check out Jack, Humane Hancock's channel, and Alex, Cosmic Skeptics. If you haven't checked their channels and you've managed to get here, thank you for coming to this channel. I don't know why you still come around. I don't upload enough, but
we have Patreons as well.
Oh yeah. They have Patreons. If you want to donate to that, PayPal.
Just throw that one in there.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure
merchandise.
If you want to be the servants,
cosmicclothing.shop. Yeah.
Oh no, actually, I will say, if you buy certain attire from Cosmic Skeptics shop, you will help fund the Vegan Society. So please consider that. And
you'll help fund the NHS by the indirect tax that I'll be paying on the income on the other t-shirts that you buy.
And for every dislike that Lewis gets on this video, he'll donate £10 to the NHS. So.
Yeah, let's see this in action. Let's see who's really right here, Lewis. Let's see how this works.
We're going to send you viral.
This becomes a social experiment. Well, thank you very much, guys, and hope you all have a good day.
Thank you.